The marketplace was alive with sound, shouting vendors, clattering crates, and the hiss of steam from cooking stalls. But in the far corner, behind the rows of brightly lit shops, the shadows were colder. There, half hidden behind an old metal bin, a small alien girl crouched. Her skin was pale and thin, her clothes torn and hanging loose from her bony frame. She pressed her knees to her chest, her wide eyes scanning the ground for something, anything, she could eat. The smell of food made her stomach twist painfully. She had been here since dawn, waiting for vendors to throw away scraps. Most days she found nothing but spoiled leftovers, but she kept waiting. Her fingers trembled as she reached for a small piece of bread that had rolled into the dirt. Before she could pick it up, a large alien male stepped in front of her. His boot came down hard, smashing the bread into the ground. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound, and kicked the crumbs away. Other vendors looked over, some shook their heads, others smirked. A few customers stopped to watch. The big alien leaned down, his voice mocking as he called her a thief and a gutter rat. The girl said nothing. She knew from experience that speaking back only made it worse. Her hands stayed at her sides, fists clenched tight, even as her empty stomach ached. A couple of children in the crowd pointed and whispered, asking why she looked so strange, why she didn't fight back. The answers came from adults nearby, angry voices saying she wasn't worth the trouble, that she was one of those aliens from the poor district. Someone suggested tossing her out before she tried to steal again. She wished she could disappear into the shadows completely, but she was too weak to run and too hungry to move away. That was when the crowd shifted. A figure stepped forward, taller than most around him, his worn leather jacket brushing against the elbows of those who moved aside. He was human, a rare sight in this part of the city. His hair was windblown, his boots dusty from travel, and a small bag hung from his shoulder. He didn't look wealthy or powerful, but he had a steady, confident way of walking that made people move without him asking. He stopped beside the girl, looking down at the piece of bread lying in the dirt. Slowly, he bent down, picked it up, and brushed the dust from it. Then, instead of tossing it away or handing it over with disdain, he crouched until his eyes were level with hers. His expression was calm, almost gentle. "Here you go, princess," he said. The word hit her like a strange sound from another world. Princess? No one had ever called her that. She stared at him, unsure if he was mocking her or serious. The human didn't smile to tease. He just held the bread out as if it truly belonged to her. The crowd went quiet. Some exchanged puzzled looks, others frowned. A vendor near the front muttered that humans were strange creatures. The big alien who had stepped on the bread scoffed loudly, asking why a human would bother saving garbage for garbage. The girl's hands shook as she reached out and took the bread. She expected him to pull it away at the last moment, but he didn't. She kept watching him, waiting for the trick, but there was none. She nibbled at the corner, her eyes still locked on him as if he might vanish. "Come on," the human said, standing and offering his hand. "You shouldn't be here." She didn't move. Trust was dangerous. Trust could hurt more than hunger. But when the big alien took a step forward, his heavy boots scraping against the stone, she panicked and reached for the human's hand without thinking. He pulled her gently to her feet, placing himself between her and the crowd. His presence was a wall, quiet but solid. He started walking, guiding her away from the marketplace. She tried to keep up with his long strides, her legs weak and unsteady. The murmurs behind them grew louder, a mix of curiosity and anger. Halfway down the street, someone shouted after them, "She's not worth saving." The human didn't stop. He didn't turn around, but his grip on her hand tightened and his voice was low when he spoke. "They're wrong." She didn't understand why he was helping her. No one had ever done it before. She wanted to ask, but her throat felt tight. All she could do was hold on as they moved farther from the crowd, away from the cold shadows of the marketplace. The street ahead was quieter, but she knew trouble could follow. She glanced back once, seeing the big alien still watching from a distance, his expression dark. A shiver ran down her spine. The human noticed. "Don't look back," he said softly. She faced forward again, clutching the bread like a precious treasure. The narrow street opened into a quieter part of the city, where the air smelled less of smoke and more of cooking. The human slowed his pace so the girl could keep up. Her bare feet slapped softly against the ground, and every few steps she glanced over her shoulder, half expecting the big alien from the market to appear. They stopped in front of a small food stall at the far edge of the district. Its walls were patched with metal sheets, and a faded sign swayed gently in the breeze. The warm smell of soup drifted from inside, carrying hints of meat, spices, and fresh bread. The girl froze at the entrance, unsure if she was even allowed inside. The human stepped in first. A stout alien cook stood behind the counter, stirring a steaming pot. His eyes narrowed when he saw the girl peeking from behind the human. "No trouble," the cook warned. "I don't feed street rats." "She's with me," the human said simply, placing a few credits on the counter. "Hot meal. Now." The cook grumbled but took the payment. He ladled thick soup into a deep bowl, adding chunks of bread on the side. The human carried it to a small table in the corner and set it down. He pulled out a chair for her, but she stayed standing, eyes fixed on the food like it might disappear. "Sit," he said gently. Slowly, she slid into the chair, her hands resting on her lap. Steam curled up from the bowl, carrying a smell that made her stomach twist painfully. She reached out, then pulled back, suspicious. Food this good was never free. She searched his face for the trick, but he only nodded toward the bowl. "It's yours," he said. She picked up the spoon, dipping it into the soup. The first taste was almost too much, rich, warm, and heavy in her mouth. Her eyes stung. She swallowed quickly, then took another spoonful and another. The bread was soft, soaking up the broth. She ate faster, afraid the food would vanish before she could finish. "Slow down," he said with a faint smile. "It's not going anywhere." But she couldn't. Hunger had ruled her for too long. Each bite was a battle between her empty stomach and the fear of losing it. Her thin shoulders shook with the effort, and she barely noticed the alien cook watching from behind the counter, muttering under his breath about wasteful humans. A pair of customers at the next table whispered to each other, glancing at her. One said she looked like trouble. Another said the human would regret getting involved. Their voices were low, but she still heard. Her hand froze halfway to her mouth. The human leaned forward, his tone quiet but firm. "Ignore them." She nodded, though she couldn't stop her ears from catching every sound. Somewhere outside, a cart rolled past, and the stall's thin walls rattled. She hunched over her food, making herself small, wishing she could melt into the shadows again. He tried to distract her. "What's your name?" Her spoon paused in the soup. She hadn't been asked that in years. Names were dangerous. They made you someone instead of nothing. She whispered it so softly that even she wasn't sure if it reached his ears. He repeated it back to her without hesitation, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Something inside her tightened. She didn't remember the last time someone had spoken her name without anger. Before she could say anything, a shadow passed across the stall's window. She stiffened instantly, her eyes darting toward it. A tall figure lingered outside, not moving on like a normal passerby. The glass was too fogged to see clearly, but the way the figure stood, still and watching, made her skin crawl. The human noticed too. He shifted slightly in his seat, angling himself so he could see both her and the door. His voice stayed calm when he said, "Finish eating." Her hands shook as she brought the spoon to her mouth. The soup no longer tasted the same. The warmth in her stomach had been replaced by a cold, nervous twist. She tried to focus on the food, but her eyes kept darting to the door. After a long moment, the shadow moved away. The cook, who had seen it too, gave the human a knowing look. "You've been followed," he said quietly. The human didn't answer. Instead, he slid the last piece of bread toward her. "Eat," he repeated. She obeyed, though each bite felt heavier than the last. When the bowl was finally empty, she sat back in the chair, her hands wrapped tightly in her lap. For a brief second, she felt the strange fullness of a real meal, but the unease in her chest remained. The human stood, dropping another coin on the table. "Let's go," he said, his tone light but his eyes alert. Outside, the air felt cooler. The street was almost empty, but she still caught herself scanning every doorway and shadow. He didn't take her hand this time, but he kept close enough that she could feel his presence beside her. She wondered where he was taking her, why he was helping, and what he wanted in return. But more than that, she wondered about the shadow at the window, and why it felt like it wouldn't be the last time she saw it. The streets narrowed as they moved deeper into the district. Buildings leaned close together, their walls cracked and patched with mismatched metal sheets. The light from the market no longer reached here. Instead, the air was dim and heavy, carrying the smell of damp stone and oil. The girl walked a few steps behind the human, her eyes darting from alley to alley. Every sound made her tense: the clink of glass, the scrape of boots, the low hum of a broken street lamp. She knew these streets better than most. They were safe in the morning, dangerous in the evening, and deadly at night. She also knew when she was being followed. Her steps slowed, her bare feet almost silent on the cracked pavement. The human noticed and stopped. "What is it?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she tilted her head just enough to make him look over his shoulder. 3 figures were there, moving casually but always keeping the same distance. Their heavy coats hid the shapes of weapons, but she didn't need to see them to know. The way they walked, too steady, too sure, told her enough. The human's jaw tightened. "Friends of yours?" Her head shook quickly, eyes wide with fear. "Gang," she whispered. They kept walking, but the human's pace changed. His strides were calm, almost lazy, but his eyes scanned every shadow, every corner. The alley bent sharply, and he led her down it without hesitation. She felt her chest tighten. She knew this bend. It had only one way out. The moment they turned, the sound of boots behind them grew louder. A voice called out, rough and mocking, "Hey, human!" The human stopped and turned halfway, keeping his body between them and the girl. The tallest of the 3 stepped forward, his face pale with strange markings that ran down his jaw. His smile was wide but cold. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," the tall one said. "She's not yours," the human replied. The second man laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Everything in the poor district is ours. That includes her." The girl flinched at the words. Her fingers clutched the back of the human's jacket, but she didn't speak. She had learned long ago that talking only made things worse. "She stole," the tall one continued, "from the wrong people. She knows the rules. The only reason she's breathing is because we let her. For this, now you're going to hand her over before we decide you're worth teaching a lesson to." The human didn't move. "No," he said simply. For a second, the alley was silent. Then the leader's smile faded. "You think you can say no to us?" "I don't think," the human said. "I know." The third man shifted his weight, his coat falling open just enough to reveal the grip of a blade. The girl's heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. She tugged on the human's sleeve, whispering urgently, "Let me go, please. They'll hurt you." His voice stayed calm. "Not happening, princess." The leader's eyes narrowed. "Princess?" He barked out a laugh. "You've been here too long, human. She's nothing. Dirt." The human took a slow step forward, forcing the 3 to pause. "Then why follow us?" he asked. The question seemed to catch them off guard, but only for a moment. The leader's smile returned, sharper this time, because dirt can be sold, and sometimes dirt knows things. His gaze slid to the girl. "She knows." The girl's stomach twisted. She had heard rumors, people disappearing because they knew things. She didn't want to be one of them. The leader pointed a long finger at the human. "This is your only warning. Leave her. Walk away. Forget you saw her. Do that, and maybe we forget about you." The human didn't blink. "Not interested." The air between them grew heavier. The second man cracked his knuckles. The third adjusted his grip on the hidden blade. The girl held her breath, expecting the fight to start. Then the leader stepped back, his eyes never leaving the human. "Fine. Keep her, for now." His tone was almost playful. "But remember, nobody protects her forever. We'll come for her tonight, and when we do, she'll wish you had left her in the street." The 3 turned and walked away, their footsteps fading into the maze of alleys. The human didn't move until the sound was gone. Then he turned to the girl. Her eyes were shiny with fear. "You can't fight them," she whispered. They don't stop." "I'm not fighting them," he said. "I'm keeping you safe." She wanted to argue, to tell him it was impossible, but the words stuck in her throat. He started walking again, and after a moment she followed. The alleys seemed darker now, every shadow a threat. As they reached a wider street, she looked up at him and asked the question she had been holding back. "Why?" His answer was simple, the same as before. "Because you're a princess." She didn't understand what he meant, but the way he said it made her chest feel strange. She didn't know if it was hope or something else. All she knew was that night was coming, and the gang's promise was real. The repair shop sat on a quiet street, far from the noise of the market. Its walls were patched with rusted plates, and a faded sign creaked above the door. The human unlocked a narrow metal staircase at the side and motioned for the girl to follow. She climbed slowly, her thin legs heavy from exhaustion, her bare feet cold against the metal steps. At the top was a small room with one window, a low bed, and a single heater in the corner. The air smelled faintly of oil and dust, but it was warm, warmer than anywhere she had been in weeks. She stopped just inside the doorway, her back pressed to the wall. "It's safe here," the human said, setting his bag down. "For now." She didn't move. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for signs of danger. A second door, hidden weapons, anything that might mean she had walked into another trap. He didn't push her. Instead, he poured water into a chipped cup and set it on the small table. "Drink," he told her. She stepped forward cautiously and took the cup. The water was clean and cool. She sipped it in small gulps, as if afraid it might vanish. When she set the cup down, he noticed dark bruises around her wrists, marks that looked like they had been left by rough hands or tight bindings. His eyes lingered on them for a moment, but he said nothing. She pulled her sleeves down quickly, avoiding his gaze. The heater clicked and hummed softly. Outside, the street was quiet, but not silent. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed, and voices carried faintly through the cold night air. She kept glancing toward the window, her body tense. "You can rest here tonight," he said. "No one will touch you." She didn't answer, only wrapped her arms around herself and sat near the wall. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small packet of dried fruit, placing it on the table. She stared at it, but didn't move closer. "Not poisoned," he said lightly, "just sweet." Her suspicion didn't fade completely, but hunger won. She took one piece, then another, chewing slowly as if trying to make it last. Hours passed. The room grew darker, lit only by the dim glow of the heater. She sat with her back to the wall, her knees pulled up, while the human leaned back in a chair, his eyes half closed but never fully asleep. Somewhere below, the sound of boots echoed faintly on the street. She froze, her gaze snapping to the door. The steps were slow and deliberate, stopping directly beneath the staircase. The human's head lifted. He raised a hand, signaling her to stay quiet. A voice drifted up from the street, deep, mocking, and all too familiar. "Human, you're keeping something that's not yours." The girl's stomach knotted. It was the gang leader. The human stood silently, his eyes locked on the door. The voice continued, "You've got until tomorrow night to hand her over. If you don't, we'll take her anyway." The footsteps retreated, but the silence that followed felt even heavier. She whispered, barely loud enough to hear, "They found me." "They'll find anyone if they look hard enough," the human replied. "But that doesn't mean they win." She hugged her knees tighter. "You don't understand. They always win." He crouched down in front of her. "Not this time." She searched his face for any sign of doubt, but found none. Something about his calm made her feel both uneasy and strangely safe. As the night deepened, the cold pressed harder against the thin walls. He pulled a folded blanket from the bed and draped it over her shoulders. She stiffened at first, then relaxed slightly as the warmth seeped in. "Try to sleep," he said. She shook her head. "If I sleep, they'll come. I'll wake up, gone. Then I'll keep watch," he said simply, returning to the chair. The heater hummed. Outside, the street noises faded one by one until the city seemed to be holding its breath. She sat there, eyes half-lidded, listening to his steady breathing. Eventually, exhaustion won, and her head tilted against the wall. The human stayed awake, his gaze fixed on the door. He knew the gang wouldn't wait long. They had given him until tomorrow night, but threats like that often came sooner. He checked the charge on his weapon, then glanced at the small figure curled under the blanket. For the first time since he had met her, she looked at peace. He wondered how many years it had been since she had last felt that way. The knock came like a sudden explosion in the silence. Heavy, deliberate, each one making the door rattle in its frame. The girl jolted awake, her eyes wide and unfocused. She looked to the human, her lips parting to speak, but he raised a finger to his lips. Another knock, louder this time. Then a deep voice, the same one from the street earlier. "Open the door, human. Hand her over, and we leave you breathing." The human stood slowly, his movements calm but deliberate. He stepped between the girl and the door, his shadow stretching across the small room. "Stay down," he murmured to her, his voice so low she barely heard it. The handle rattled violently. Metal scraped against metal as someone tried to force it open. The girl's breathing quickened. She wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, shrinking into the corner. The voice outside grew sharper. "Don't be stupid. She's not worth dying for." The human's eyes narrowed. "She's worth more than you'll ever know," he called back. Silence followed, heavy and tense. Then footsteps shifted outside, more than one set. They spoke in low voices, the words too muffled to hear clearly. The girl's gaze darted to the window, wondering if they would try to break in another way. Something slid under the door with a faint scratching sound. The human bent down and picked it up. It was a small, dirty piece of paper. A crude drawing of the girl's face filled the center, a thick red X slashed over it. Underneath, in messy handwriting, were the words, "Tomorrow she disappears." He crumpled the paper in his fist and dropped it into the small heater, watching the flames curl around it. "Not happening," he said, almost to himself. Outside, the footsteps retreated. The building fell quiet again, but the silence didn't feel safe. It felt like the pause before a storm. The girl's voice trembled. "They mean it. If they say tomorrow, they'll come before then." "I know," he replied, already moving to his bag. He began pulling out items, small packets of food, a folded map, extra ammunition. He checked his weapon again, loading it with a quiet click. Her eyes followed him. "You're leaving?" "We're leaving," he corrected. "Before sunrise." She hesitated. "If you run with me, they'll come after you too." He glanced over his shoulder. "They already will. Might as well make it worth the trouble." She didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to tell him to just walk away, to let her deal with it alone. But another part, the part that had felt a strange warmth when he called her princess, couldn't imagine him turning his back now. He pulled a small cloak from the bottom of his bag and tossed it to her. "Put that on. It'll hide your face." The fabric was rough but warm. She draped it over her shoulders, the hood falling low over her eyes. Her hands fidgeted with the edge, a nervous habit she couldn't stop. The hours crawled by. Neither of them slept. The human sat in the chair, weapon across his lap, eyes fixed on the door. The girl stayed in the corner, pulling the blanket around herself beneath the cloak. Every creak of the old building made her flinch. At one point, the faint crunch of boots on gravel echoed from below. The human's hand tightened on his weapon, but the steps faded without stopping. Finally, the faintest hint of pale light touched the edge of the window. The human stood. Time to go. She rose slowly, her legs stiff from sitting so long. He slung his bag over one shoulder, then opened the door a crack to check the street. It was empty, but the air felt tense, as if the city itself was holding back. They stepped into the cold morning. The street was quiet, but the girl kept her head down, her eyes on the ground. She didn't want to see if anyone was watching. As they walked, she couldn't help but glance up at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her when he answered. "Because you deserve more than scraps and fear. Every princess does." The word hit her again. Princess. It sounded strange in her ears, like it belonged to someone else. And yet, when he said it, she almost believed it could belong to her. They moved quickly, disappearing into the maze of side streets, the sound of the market beginning to rise in the distance. But in her chest, she knew the gang wouldn't be far behind. They may never let go of what they claimed. And now, for reasons she couldn't yet understand, the human had claimed her too. The sky was still pale when they reached the outer edge of the district. Mist hung low over the streets, curling around the corners of buildings and hiding the view ahead. The human kept a steady pace, his hand resting on the strap of his bag, his eyes scanning every shadow. The girl stayed close behind, clutching the edge of his jacket so she wouldn't lose him in the fog. They turned down a narrow lane toward the transport station. It was the only place where they could find a ride out of the city before the gangs closed in. The air was damp, and their footsteps sounded too loud against the cracked stone. She kept glancing over her shoulder, certain they were being followed. The sound came suddenly, boots pounding the ground behind them. She froze, but the human grabbed her hand and pulled her forward. "Run," he said, his voice low but urgent. They darted through the lane, weaving between carts and crates. The mist made it hard to see, but the echoes of pursuit were clear. More footsteps joined the first, the sound bouncing off the walls. She didn't have to look to know it was the gang. Two shapes appeared ahead, blocking the street. The human didn't hesitate. He yanked her down a side alley, their boots splashing through puddles. The alley was tight, lined with overflowing trash bins and hanging laundry that slapped against them as they ran. Behind them, voices shouted orders, closing in from every direction. She stumbled on a loose stone, nearly falling, but his grip kept her upright. Her breath came in ragged gasps and her legs burned. "I can't," she started, but he cut her off. "Yes, you can. Keep going." They burst into a wider street, only to see more gang members spilling in from the far end. Without slowing, the human dragged her toward a stack of crates, shoving one aside to reveal a narrow opening behind it. They slipped into a hidden service tunnel, the darkness swallowing them whole. The air inside was cold and smelled of rust. Water dripped somewhere ahead, echoing in the narrow space. The girl's breaths were loud in the silence. She pressed close to him, her heart pounding. "They'll search everywhere," she whispered. "Not here," he said. "Not yet." They moved quietly through the tunnel, their steps muffled on the damp floor. Somewhere above, the gang's voices faded, replaced by the distant rumble of the waking city. After what felt like forever, they emerged into another street, this one nearly empty except for a few early workers heading to the docks. The human loosened his hold on her hand but didn't let go completely. "We're close," he said. She didn't answer. Her mind was still replaying the chase, the echo of boots, the shouts in the fog. Every time she blinked, she saw the red X from the note under the door. She had lived with fear for so long that it had become part of her, but this was different. This was a fear that could take the only person who had stood between her and the darkness. The station came into view, its metal structure looming above the rooftops. The hum of engines and the hiss of steam drifted into the street. She felt a flicker of hope. If they could get on a transport, maybe they could vanish before the gang caught up. But as they approached, she noticed figures standing near the entrance. Even from a distance, she recognized the way they stood, their eyes scanning the crowd. Gang lookouts. The human saw them too. He steered her into another alley before they could be spotted. "They're expecting us here," he murmured. Her chest tightened. "Then what now?" "We find another way," he said. "Princesses don't walk into traps." The word made her pause. She still didn't understand why he kept calling her that. But every time he said it, it felt like a promise. They doubled back through narrow lanes, avoiding main streets. The human kept glancing at the sky, judging the time. The mist was thinning, and the city was waking. Once the streets filled, moving unnoticed would be harder. In the distance, a transport horn sounded, a deep, low note that meant departure. She looked at him, worried. "We're going to miss it." "Better to miss it than not make it at all," he replied. They passed a row of closed shops, their shutters dented and covered in faded paint. In the gap between two buildings, he found another service tunnel entrance. This one sloped downward, leading toward the docks. "This way," he said. She hesitated at the dark opening. "What if it's dangerous?" "It is," he said plainly, "but so is everything else right now." They slipped inside, the tunnel swallowing them once again. This time, the air was warmer, carrying the faint scent of salt and oil. The sound of engines grew louder, and somewhere ahead she saw the glow of light. When they reached the end, they emerged behind a stack of shipping containers at the far edge of the docks. From here, they could see smaller transport ships being loaded. No lookouts stood nearby. The human crouched beside her. "One of those will get us out," he said. She glanced up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "And then what?" "Then," he said with a faint smile, "you start living like a princess." For the first time since the market, she almost believed him. But she knew the gang was still out there, and they wouldn't stop until they had her. The dock was quiet except for the low hum of engines and the occasional clang of metal as cargo was moved. The human led the girl between towering stacks of containers, keeping to the shadows. Her hood was pulled low over her face, and she stayed close, her small footsteps almost silent. Ahead, a narrow platform led to a small cargo ship with its loading ramp still down. A single figure stood near the entrance, a broad-shouldered pilot with grease on his hands and a cap pulled low over his brow. The human approached without hesitation. "You owe me a favor," the human said. The pilot raised an eyebrow. "I thought you'd never collect. What's the job?" "Get us off-world," the human replied. He shifted slightly so the girl was hidden behind him. "Quietly." The pilot glanced past him and caught sight of her. His expression tightened. "She trouble?" "Only if the wrong people find her," the human said. The pilot hesitated, then nodded toward the ship. 5 minutes. We leave with the next tide cycle." The human thanked him and motioned for the girl to follow. She stepped up the ramp slowly, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. The air inside the ship was warmer, carrying the scent of fuel and metal. She stopped halfway, looking back toward the open dock. "They'll come," she whispered. "They'll try," he said. The pilot moved to the cockpit, leaving them alone in the narrow cargo bay. The girl lowered her hood, letting her face breathe the cool air. She had never been on a ship before. The walls seemed to hum under her fingertips. The human crouched beside her. "Once we're in the air, they can't touch you." Her lips parted, but before she could speak, a noise from outside froze them both. The sharp echo of boots hitting metal. Voices followed, low but urgent. "They're here," she breathed. The human moved quickly, shutting the cargo ramp halfway to cut their line of sight. Through the gap, he saw them, half a dozen gang members spilling onto the dock, their eyes scanning the rows of containers. At the front was the tall leader, the same cold smile on his face. "Search everything," the leader barked. The human stepped back from the ramp and whispered to the pilot, "Now, we go now." "Engines aren't fully warmed," the pilot warned. "Doesn't matter." The pilot cursed under his breath but began powering up the ship. The low rumble grew, vibrating through the floor. The gang heard it instantly. Shouts rang out, boots pounding against the dock as they ran toward the ship. The girl clutched the human's arm. "They'll shoot us down." "Not if we're fast," he said. The first shot cracked through the air, hitting the side of the ship with a sharp clang. The pilot yelled for them to hold on. The engines roared, and the ramp began lifting. 2 gang members reached it just in time to slam their hands against the metal, but the human kicked one back and slammed the locking mechanism into place. The ship lurched, rising from the dock in a slow, heavy climb. More shots rang out, but none pierced the hull. The leader stood at the far end of the dock, watching them rise with a calm that was more dangerous than rage. He raised his hand in a silent promise. This wasn't over. The city shrank below them, the fog curling over its rooftops like a ghost. The girl sat on the floor, her knees pulled to her chest, breathing hard. The human knelt beside her, steadying her with a hand on her shoulder. "You're safe," he said quietly. She looked at him, her eyes shining with something more than fear. "Why?" she asked again. "Why do this for me?" He studied her for a moment before answering. "Because you deserve to be more than what they said you were. You're not a beggar, you're not a thief, you're a princess, and every princess deserves someone to fight for her." Her throat tightened. No one had ever said words like that to her. She didn't know how to respond, so she just nodded, holding on to them like they were something precious. The pilot called back from the cockpit. "We're clear of the atmosphere. Next stop, anywhere you want." The human glanced at her. "You get to choose." She hesitated, thinking of the alleys, the market, the cold nights, and the heavy boots that had chased her for so long. "Somewhere far," she said finally. "Somewhere they'll never find me." He smiled faintly. "Then that's where we'll go." The hum of the ship was steady now, no longer rushed or strained. She moved to the small round window, watching the planet grow smaller against the black of space. The sight was overwhelming, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. She pressed her forehead to the glass and whispered her name softly, as if testing how it sounded here, far from the place where it had only brought her trouble. This time she said it with pride. The human heard her and repeated it, just as he had in the market, but now it felt like a promise. Somewhere behind them, the city and its dangers still waited, but ahead lay a sky full of stars. For the first time in her life, she believed she might actually belong somewhere, and that someone would be there to make sure she stayed free.